There is a base in the desert outside Abu Dhabi that most Americans have never heard of. It sits on Emirati soil, it flies the American flag, and for decades it has been the beating heart of United States air power in the Persian Gulf. Al Dhafra Air Base. From its runways, American F-35s have flown. From its hangars, American reconnaissance aircraft have monitored every movement across Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and the wider region. It has hosted joint exercises between American and Israeli pilots. It has been, in every meaningful sense, the physical expression of a partnership that Washington considered unshakable. And then, on a single day in January 2026, the country that owns that soil looked at the United States of America and said no. Tonight, we tell the story of how that happened, how decades of American military presence in the Gulf, built on assumptions of loyalty and shared interest, collided with the brutal reality of a war that no one in the region asked for. How the United Arab Emirates, one of America's closest and most strategically vital partners in the Middle East, formally denied Washington the use of its territory and airspace for military operations against Iran. How that decision exposed something that American policymakers had long suspected, but never wanted to say out loud. That the Gulf states were never unconditional allies. They were calculating partners. And when the calculation changed, so did they. This is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about something far more uncomfortable. The gap between what America believed its relationships in the Middle East to be and what they actually were. To understand what happened in January 2026, we need to go back further, much further. The United States military moved into the Persian Gulf in 1971, filling the vacuum left by Britain's withdrawal from its East of Suez commitments. For 50 years, American bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and beyond formed the architectural backbone of American power projection across the entire region. These were not just military installations. They were political statements, physical proof of American commitment to the security of the Gulf and the free flow of its oil to world markets. The Gulf states, for their part, welcomed this arrangement. American military presence meant protection from Iran, from Iraq, from any regional power that might threaten their survival. It was, on its surface, a mutually beneficial arrangement. America got forward bases. The Gulf states got security guarantees. And for decades, the arrangement held. But underneath the surface, the relationship was always more fragile than its ceremonial expressions suggested. As early as February 2024, Emirati officials quietly informed the United States that American warplanes and drones based at Al Dhafra would no longer be permitted to carry out strikes in Yemen and Iraq without advance notification from Abu Dhabi. An unnamed UAE official told reporters at the time that restrictions had been imposed on strike missions and that those restrictions were coming from a place of self-protection. The Pentagon's response was immediate and practical. It began relocating some of its Al Dhafra aircraft to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That episode received almost no coverage in the American mainstream media. It was treated as a minor operational footnote. It was not. It was the beginning of the end of the old arrangement, a signal sent clearly and deliberately by Abu Dhabi that the terms of its relationship with Washington were being renegotiated. America simply did not want to hear it. The key of independence then came December 2025. On December 28th, protests erupted across Iran after a sharp collapse of the country's currency amid soaring inflation and worsening living conditions. Iranian authorities responded with a brutal crackdown. Human Rights Watch found evidence of a coordinated escalation in the use of lethal force, with protesters and bystanders shot in the head and torso. The death toll remained contested due to a communications blackout. Iran's government put the figure at just over 3,000. Human rights activists counted at least 6,000 dead. The images coming out of Iran, smuggled on phones, shared on encrypted apps, horrified the world. And in Washington, President Donald Trump saw an opportunity. The Moscow Times, speaking in Detroit in January 2026, Trump told Iranian protesters to keep protesting, and that help was on its way, vowing to punish security forces responsible for the killings and announcing he had canceled all meetings with Iranian officials. The United States began its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying air, naval, and missile defense assets across the region at a pace that alarmed every government from Riyadh to Ankara. And then the Gulf states did something that Washington had not anticipated. They drew a line. The Moscow Times. The UAE stated publicly and formally that it would not allow military operations against Iran from its territory or airspace. Qatar made the same statement. Turkey did the same. And in the most significant signal of all, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman told Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian directly that the kingdom would not permit the use of its airspace for any strike on Iran. The Abraham Accords, hailed by the Trump administration's first term as a generational diplomatic triumph, a realignment of the Middle East around shared American and Israeli security interests, had just been tested by the reality of actual war. And they had cracked. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was at that moment sailing toward the Gulf of Oman. President Trump had just told reporters America had a big flotilla heading in that direction and was ready to act with speed and violence if necessary. And the country that hosts the centerpiece of American military infrastructure in the Gulf had formally and publicly said no. The Moscow Times, the Kyiv Independent. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint military strikes against Iran anyway, beginning what became known as Operation Epic Fury. And Iran hit back. Hard. Iran's retaliation saw thousands of drones and missiles fired at American bases and host nations across the Persian Gulf. American radar systems, hangars, warehouses, and command centers took heavy fire over the course of 6 weeks. At Camp Buehring in Kuwait, an Iranian F-5 fighter jet penetrated air defenses and struck the base, the first time an enemy fixed-wing aircraft had hit an American military installation in years. One strike on a makeshift operations center near Shuaiba, Kuwait killed 6 American Army soldiers and wounded dozens more. Attacks were reported at bases in Iraq, Jordan, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. At Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, an attack killed a 26-year-old soldier from Kentucky. Newsweek. The UAE was hit particularly hard. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps confirmed it had specifically targeted Al Dhafra Air Base near Abu Dhabi, the centerpiece of American military presence in the country, as part of its operations against American military assets in the region. UAE oil facilities were also damaged during the conflict. Hundreds of drone and missile strikes hit Emirati territory. The country that had refused to allow American aircraft to strike Iran from its soil was being struck by Iran anyway, for hosting American forces. Abu Dhabi had tried to stay out of the war. The war came to Abu Dhabi regardless. Breaking defense. The defense. News. And in that paradox, in that terrible, ironic reality, something shifted in the Emirati national conversation that no amount of diplomatic language could reverse. UAE University professor Abdul Khalik Abdullah, a former advisor to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and one of the most prominent voices in Emirati strategic thinking, declared publicly that it was time to think about closing the American bases in the country. The UAE no longer needs America to defend it, he wrote. It has proven during the Iranian aggression that it is capable of defending itself with distinction. Abdullah posted on social media that the American bases had become, in his words, a burden and not a strategic asset. The Defense News Newsweek. These were not the words of a fringe voice or an opposition figure. Abdul Khalik Abdullah has direct relationships with the Emirati leadership. When he speaks, he reflects, at minimum, the range of opinions circulating at the highest levels of Abu Dhabi's power structure. And what he was saying, stripped of diplomatic courtesy, was devastating in its implications. America's military presence in the UAE had not protected the UAE. It had made the UAE a target. The arrangement that was supposed to provide security had delivered insecurity. The bases that were supposed to deter attack had attracted it. A set of State Department cables reported by Politico painted an even more troubling picture. American diplomats described concerns in Bahrain about public perceptions that the United States had abandoned its Gulf partners to focus on protecting Israel. In Bahrain specifically, where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is headquartered, perhaps the single most strategically important American naval installation in the world, the cables warned that the war was damaging America's reputation in ways that would outlast the fighting. Vali Nasser, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, put it plainly at a public panel. The United States, he said, was not only unable or unwilling to defend the Gulf countries, it could not actually defend itself. Its own bases were being struck, its own soldiers were dying, and the countries that hosted those bases were being punished for it. Newsweek prior to the conflict, the United States had evacuated most personnel from its bases in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, and Iraq. The optics of that evacuation, American forces pulling back from installations they had occupied for decades before a single shot had been fired, were not lost on the Gulf states watching. The question that had always lurked beneath the surface of the American-Gulf relationship was now being asked openly, in public, in Arabic. If America evacuates before the war begins, what exactly is the guarantee worth? The defense post-Operation Epic Fury consumed thousands of Patriot and THAAD interceptors in barely 2 weeks of combat, draining inventories that were already at critically low levels after years of support to Ukraine. The United States was pulling missile defense components from South Korea and the Indo-Pacific to sustain operations in the Middle East. The global reach of American military power, the ability to project force simultaneously in multiple theaters, was being tested to its limits. And the Gulf states, watching American interceptor stockpiles drain and American bases take fire and American diplomats send anxious cables, were drawing their own conclusions about the future of the relationship. YouTube. Michael Rubin, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former Pentagon official with deep experience in the Middle East, wrote in April 2026 that across the region, basing had proved more of a liability than an asset. He argued that no matter how many Patriot systems the United States deploys, troops stationed so close to the front will always be vulnerable to ballistic missiles and drones. And he noted something more fundamental. Basing in the Middle East gives host countries a de facto veto over American missions. When those countries decide their interests diverge from Washington's, as the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey all did in January 2026, America's forward military posture becomes not a source of leverage, but a constraint on its own freedom of action. The defense post. This is the part of the story that is hardest for Washington to absorb, because the United States did not lose the Gulf through incompetence or neglect. It lost it through a fundamental misreading of what its relationships there actually were. The Gulf states were never ideological allies. They were not partners in a shared vision of democracy or human rights or a rules-based international order. They were strategic partners in a narrower sense, countries that needed American security guarantees at a particular moment in their development, and that hosted American bases in exchange for those guarantees. But the moment the cost of hosting those bases, measured in Iranian missiles falling on Emirati oil facilities, in Bahraini public opinion turning against the Americans, in Qatari officials fielding angry calls from Tehran, exceeded the benefit of the American security umbrella, the calculation changed. And when the calculation changed, the answer changed. No. There is a particular bitter irony involving the Abraham Accords. Those 2020 normalization agreements between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel were hailed as a generational diplomatic achievement, a realignment of the Middle East around shared security interests with America at the center. The UAE and the U.S. Air Force had conducted joint aerial exercises from Al Diafra under the Enduring Lightning program. Israeli and American F-35s had trained together from Emirati soil. The architecture of regional integration seemed solid. And then, in the context of an actual shooting war, the precise scenario the entire architecture was supposedly designed to manage, the UAE refused to allow the base from which it had conducted joint drills with Israeli aircraft to be used to attack Iran. The accords had been tested by reality, and reality won. The key of independence. Where does this leave America? Where does it leave the Gulf? Those questions do not have clean answers yet. The Trump administration approved over $23 billion in weapons sales to Middle Eastern allies under attack from Iran, including Patriot missile systems, drones, helicopters, and missile defense radars for the UAE. America is still selling. The Gulf is still buying. The financial and industrial ties that bind Washington to Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Doha remain deep and complex. No one is talking about a complete rupture, but the nature of the relationship has changed. The pretense that American military presence in the Gulf is a gift, freely given, unconditionally received, and gratefully maintained, that pretense is over. As even UAE voices sympathetic to Washington have noted, time has come to review the value added of American bases to the Emirati national defense portfolio. That is not the language of an ally. It is the language of a client evaluating a contractor. The Defense News Military Watch magazine. And perhaps that is the most honest description of what the relationship has always been. A contract, valuable when the terms served both parties, subject to renegotiation when they didn't. The United States spent decades telling itself a story about its place in the Middle East, a story in which American bases represented not just military presence, but moral commitment, not just power projection, but genuine partnership. The events of 2026 have not ended that presence, but they have ended that story. The Gulf states are not betraying America. They are simply telling the truth that the relationship has always been, about what they need, what they will accept, and where their limits lie. That truth is uncomfortable. It is not, however, a surprise. It was always there, in the quiet conversations, in the 2024 flight restrictions, in the January 2026 statements, in the Arabic social media posts of a professor with connections to a crown prince. America just wasn't listening. Now, in the rubble of Operation Epic Fury, with its bases damaged and its soldiers buried, and its credibility in the cables of anxious diplomats, it has no choice but to hear it. This has been tonight's documentary. Good night.